Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Lee, and I'm here with Justin Tiemeyer for our second edition of Worth the Popcorn, movie reviews of recent movies that have just come out into theaters. It's our goal to see them as quickly as possible and then get a review out to you. Our first one was Poor Things, that is up for a number of Academy Awards on March 10th. This next one that we're going to do, Justin chose, and I was wholeheartedly psyched about it, and it is Dune 2. We had both seen Dune 1, and we're very excited to see Dune 2, and we thought it'd be a great one to review. So just to give you a little background of Dune 2, it's the sequel, obviously, to Dune. Which is it really? It's part 2, I guess. Dune Part 2. Dune, the first Dune was in 2021, and Dune 2 is the second part of a 2-part adaptation of the 1965 novel Dune by Frank Herbert. It follows Paul Atreides as he unites with the Fremen people of the desert planet Arrakis to wage war against the House Harkonnen. Timothy Chalamet is the star. He stars as Paul Atreides. His mother, Rebecca Ferguson, plays Jessica. Josh Brolin is in it. He plays Gurney Halleck. Stellan Skarsgård, who you could barely recognize, but you can kind of see him in his eyes. He is Baron Harkonnen. Dave Bautista is Beast Rabin. Zendaya plays a big role in this movie as Johnny. And then you have a couple other kind of minor characters. Not really. I guess they play an important role. Charlotte Rampling, who plays the Reverend Mother Mohiam. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. And then Javier Bardem, who's phenomenal as Stilgar, as one of the Fremen indigenous people. And they all kind of were in the first one, and we have some new characters in the second one. And some interesting stars who came to the second one. So that's a bit of an intro to Dune. And I guess, Justin, is there a place you want to start when it comes to reviewing this?
Yeah. So the question that's most important to me is: Have you read any of the books?
I have not.
Neither have I. So
Good.
We are unqualified to review this movie. Everybody who's listening, just ignore what we're saying.
That's for the folks who are deep addicts of this movie.
Right, there's a cult of Dune.
Yes.
I mean, it has been rated by most organizations as either the best-selling or the best science fiction novel of all time. The first one.
Yeah.
I haven't read it. I have kind of an uncomfortable history with Dune. I have tried to read it about 4 times. And I just can't get into it. I love the ideas. I love the skeleton from what a lot of people have told me about it. But the books were really hard for me to get into. And apparently, I've been told the first half of the first book and the fourth book are the best parts. And the rest is like a slog to get through. And I was like, I thought it was a slog to get through the first half. But I really love the movies.
Yeah.
And with what I know about Dune, right, there's been a lot of iterations of this, but most people look at the novel series, the 1984,
Sting
cult hit.
Sting was in that one.
Right.
Yeah.
And with Agent Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks in it.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle MacLachlan. And then this new one, this to me is the best presentation we've ever had of Dune. The folks who are big fans of the novels are probably going to be mad at me because I like it better. And I was actually reading that there's that's part of the reason why a lot of Herbert's other novels didn't take off. Is he's got all these ideas, he's got good bones to it, but the presentation is rough. So I feel a little bit more. Obviously, we're going to get some hate mail. There's the cult.
I don't know where they're going to mail it to.
Yes, exactly. We haven't told them where to mail it. So if you hate me because I haven't read Dune and I didn't like the book as much, I'm sure you'll find me.
I think people will be forgiving, especially since you already, we have told them we have not read the book, but we do love the movies.
And you brought up pronunciation earlier. Do you pronounce it Harkonnen or Harkonnen? That's apparently a big thing too.
Okay, well, the movie I think is Harkonnen.
Okay.
That's the way it was said, I believe, in the movie. I don't know how it was.
Because I think there's basically like religious sects within the cult of Dune that say Harkonnen and Harkonnen.
Yeah.
And, the other sect which says they must fall, they're terrible, evil people. But anyways, so genre.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's called science fiction.
Sure.
Within science fiction, where do you think it fits?
Oh, geez, I feel like it's a very real story. You do get a sense that it's out in space, but most of the setting takes place on Arrakis, which is this desert planet, and it feels very modern in a lot of ways. Yes, there's certain science fiction elements to it, or parts of their uniforms that are inventions that have been made to help them breathe and live in a desert planet and things like that. But for the most part, it felt very modern, even though I believe the real time is 10,000 something, so it's many, many years from now. What we do see with a little of the science fiction, more of that element, is when we go to different planets. For example, when we go to Harkonnen, the House of Harkonnen, the planet Harkonnen, and we see maybe a little more of that science fiction, and we do see some elements of space travel and things of that nature. But for the most part, it's a kind of a modern setting of Dune and the people trying to survive there and all the conflicts that happen. I don't know what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I mean, so from my reading, it's usually described as light sci-fi. So from what I understand of that is that we're not focusing as much on the faster than light engines and all that kind of stuff. That's happening in the background. And we're focusing on the real human stuff that we're used to, right? That there's the melange spice, which is basically like oil in the desert. Everybody wants it. It's a great resource. It's basically a leisure resource when you think about it.
It's like a drug in a way, correct?
Right.
And it's got medicinal purposes, but also psychedelic purposes, from what I understand.
I was expecting this book series to have like the most unique and interesting origins, but apparently Frank Herbert was writing a newspaper article about dunes in like Washington State, and B, he was interested in psilocybin, and that's how Dune happened.
Well, what's interesting about that, you touched on the spice, which really is the main driver of the conflict here, right? You have and this is something that you can relate to in our world today. If you mentioned oil, and so oil is needed, by many countries in the world, and countries that are first world countries need to produce cars to move and things like that, and so I really thought it was an interesting parallel where you had these outside worlds in Dune coming to Arrakis for their spice, and they would go in and really try to just kind of, for lack of a better term, rape the land. They really try to get as much spice as possible, and then at the expense of this indigenous people, the Fremen, who are there living there, and it's their world, and they're used to all these people from outside their world coming in and stealing all their natural resources. And it's interesting parallels to today's world as well, and how the Fremen people have survived over the decades, centuries of these colonists, in a way, coming in, trying to take their natural resources. I thought that was a really interesting base conflict of this story. And then you have, the added conflict of these different groups of outsiders coming in, vying for power for this spice, so that they could have control kind of the universe in a way.
Yeah. So loosely, the plot of this second installation in the Dune movie series, we've got, in the first movie, we had the Atreides family come to Dune. Duke Leto Atreides is known as a kind of, kind and generous, decent Duke. That's pointed out as a weakness in the second movie. And in the first movie, I think it would be hard to argue otherwise, because the Atreides basically get wiped off the planet.
Well, and it's at the charge of the Emperor, right? They didn't really want to go, but the Atreides people did not want to go, but the Emperor asked them to go, and you don't say no to the Emperor.
And presumably this is, essentially a planet full of people that's moved to this deserted planet and then genocided. For political purposes. Now, the second one starts with Paul, the son of Leto, and his mother, Lady Jessica, who is pregnant with another child. They're kind of in the planetary diaspora, right? They're with the Fremen. They're out and about. Their existence is put into question. And there is like a 1984 style approved perspective of what happened on this. There are no witnesses to give a contrary experience. And we meet the Emperor, and there's a little bit of dramatic irony where it's basically, oh, well, there's no one around to tell the story. And then we see people of the line of Atreides on the planet, and we think, ooh, this could lead to some real conflict. And it does. I think it's a little bit difficult to outline the plot, because a lot of it is desert banditry meeting, just we're barreling towards this ultimate conflict that's going to happen between these great houses. I think that's a loose idea of the plot.
I think and then the sort of secondary plot has to do with Paul himself, right? So Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, are kind of the only known survivors of the Atreides people. They now try to form an alliance with the Fremen people, who don't take to outsiders very well for obvious reasons, but they end up proving themselves to the Fremen people, becoming part of their tribe. And in the process, Paul has shown signs of this leadership that the Fremen people are very interested in, because they believe a Messiah. They're very religious people. They believe in their myths. They believe a Messiah is going to come from the outside world to save their planet and to save their people. And there's a question on whether or not Paul is this Messiah. And he proves himself a number of times throughout the movie in certain things. The only one I'll give away is that, he rides the worm. It's kind of a big moment, and riding a worm if somebody can do that, it's really difficult. Is if you see these worms, they're massive, massive beings, and so the Fremen people are able to do this fairly easily. And Paul, this outsider, has to prove himself to them by doing it. And to make a long story short, he does it. There's a lot of drama to it, but so to me, this is a kind of a key plot element to this movie is Paul and the question of whether he is this Messiah, because he does prove himself a number of times. Now, what comes out of that is that Paul, because of the spice, it does give outsiders visions. He's had visions before, so he has these visions of what his future may hold. And so, but there are questions on whether or not that these things are going to happen. Is he the Messiah? Is he going to help these people? Is he not going to help these people? And so that's what's kind of interesting, in that little plot device takes some turns. You start to believe that maybe he is the Messiah, but then something happens and the question comes up because of what he does, or something happens in the plot that maybe he's not the Messiah.
Right.
And he and his mother maybe tricking the Fremen people. So we are still led by the end of the movie to that question still remains, which I think is really cool that they didn't, they didn't tell us actually at the end of the movie how that's going to be resolved. So I think that's a really important part of this movie is Paul as the main character and how he could be this Messiah for the Fremen people and to save their country. But on the other hand, he could not at the same time.
So I'm really happy you brought that up, because it speaks to a kind of problematic trope that we see in a lot of literature and film. It's the white savior trope. The idea that some indigenous group needs some white outsider to save them. I think we saw some of it in Dances with Wolves.
Sure.
We see it with just about everything.
Right.
And I think it's an interesting thing to look at, because if you go in, I mean, you have to know this is what's happening before you even set foot in part 2, if you have a loose idea of what's going on in the story and if you remember what happened in the first one. I'm interested in how the writer-director Denis Villeneuve deals with it, right? Because there are phases.
Yeah.
And it feels like he's recognizing and engaging with the white savior thing, because he starts us off with this idea that Paul is first and foremost motivated by revenge. His dad has died. This is the tale as old as time, right?
Yeah.
You killed my pappy, now you're gonna pay. You know, it's you don't have to have much more complexity than that to have a story. So, but in order to be the savior for this people, he has to lose his ego, become part of them, and serve them.
Yes.
And I think for a time we believe that's going to happen.
Sure.
And I'm almost the most interested in the ways that gets turned on its head.
Yeah.
Because to me, that's a way of saying this white savior thing is happening, and there's a real possibility that this character we're supposed to like and relate to is not an okay person to like and relate.
Right. Well, that's, to me, I haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon, but apparently that's very similar.
Okay.
In that regard, where Leo DiCaprio comes into a Native American population and kind of wins them over. You know, I haven't seen it, but I think there's also, he's sort of this white savior.
Right. For the sake of exploitation.
Yeah, exactly. A figure as well, and then what happens in the end. So you're right. So I think Johnny, who's an indigenous woman who falls in love, they both fall in love with each other. So we think.
Right.
With Paul, who is white, I think she is able to see a little bit through him. And that's another question toward, that we see. We're given that little plot piece towards the end of this film, and I feel like that's going to play itself out once we get to the third installment of Dune.
And when you were talking about the plot, even as you were describing it, you brought it back to the psyche of Paul.
Yeah.
And I loved that that's where you went with it, because I think, forgive the pun or don't forgive the pun, this is a sandbox movie. It has a bunch of different actors who are just doing things.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's not as important as what's going on inside of Paul's being.
Right.
And I found it really interesting how he has to cycle through a few different identities that he was either forced into or he took on himself, right? So he is an Atreides. He was taught that kindness and gentleness is correct, that you should rule lovingly,
Yeah.
that you should, that there is some value to service. And the Harkonnens, say that's basically why you got wiped off. That's weakness. You can't rule like that.
Right.
There was no way you had any chance.
Right.
You were going to get eaten alive by this desert planet. We also see that his mother is Bene Gesserit.
Mm-hmm.
And he is in some way Bene Gesserit.
Which, could you explain that, Bene Gesserit,
Yeah.
what that is?
So it seems like a religious group.
Yes.
But we learn that it's almost more of a...
There's power. There's
Right.
power behind it. They do seek power, but use religion, which we've
Right.
seen in our own
Which
society.
came first, the belief system or this power thing that they're seeking?
Sure.
And again, I haven't read the book series. In the first movie, I think you would say it's the religion, the belief system comes first, and these people are serving it. In the second movie, I get more of a feeling that power is the ultimate end.
Yeah.
And these are a group of women
Yeah.
who are trying to see beyond the basic lower level battles between the houses.
Right. There's a larger plan.
They're
that they have.
transcending it,
Yeah.
and they're beyond the houses. They're better than that. And they're supposed to have daughters,
Yeah.
but Paul is a son to them, and he has in some way a Bene Gesserit identity, right?
Yes.
And that has a lot to do with the savior thing, right?
Right.
The Bene Gesserit have had an influence on some of the Fremen, and because that happened in the past, we've got little groups here and fundamentalists there that are willing to accept him.
Yeah.
For his mother's in the background being like, "Oh yes, we'll win this."
Yes.
And,
Yes.
we've
she's
got everything.
an interesting character
Mhm.
too, right? Because she is sort of pushing Paul in a certain direction, it seems. And Paul, as any son or daughter would, he's in his probably early 20s. There's some pushback to that,
Mhm.
and sometimes we feel like he's going in a different direction, and there are other times where we feel like, oh, maybe he's following what his mother would like to do as well. And so she's an interesting character who's also sort of in this background, who's sort of at the chess table, sort of moving chess pieces around, and Paul seems to be maybe one of those chess pieces, but he's figuring out maybe that he is one, and he's recognizing that, and he's becoming maybe a little more independent in his decisions, but that's still in question, which is kind of neat.
So I'm 41.
I'm not telling you my age.
You don't have to. But one thing I've always
I'm
found
older.
really interesting is who you relate to in the movie. When I look at Paul, and I'm going to try not to tear up, I see my oldest son, Cliff. And so...
Who's younger.
Yes, he's younger than Paul.
Yeah.
But do you think they would have cared if Paul was 7 years old? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's still going to be this Bene Gesserit wizard.
Right.
And he's still going to have this terrible purpose. And they're still going to use him for their purposes and throw him into their wars. So that was my question is do you when you put yourself in this movie,
Yeah.
are you Paul? Are you the parents that are manipulating stuff? Where do you place yourself?
I don't necessarily. I'd like to say I'm like Josh Brolin.
Yeah.
He's this good-looking
wouldn't?
older hunk.
Cut of that jaw.
My age. But no, I guess I don't put myself in it whatsoever or relate to anybody in particular. I guess more of the character. Really, it's the main character, Paul, and how is he going to get through this. But then you have some important minor characters too. I think Johnny is a very compelling, played by what is her name? Oh, Zendaya. Sorry, she's got one name. She's like an actress model, and very she's very compelling, and because she is a modern Fremen person. So the North is sort of more of this modern thought process and belief system in the northern part of the country, and then you have a southern fundamentalist, and she's more of a northern open-minded character. But I feel as though she's really important. Wasn't sure how important she would be because we see visions of her in the first Dune, but then we actually meet her in the second one, and she becomes a very important person. And so I guess I wouldn't relate to a character, but I'm very interested to see how that's going to play out between Johnny and Paul, because they become lovers and deep friends, but then there becomes this rift at the end. So I guess I didn't necessarily connect with any of the characters in the same way you did.
Yeah, and the reason I bring it up is I think the standard way to approach something like this is you go through the protagonist, which is Paul, and you think, oh, I'm faced with these dilemmas and I have to overcome them. And it put me in a place thinking about my own, oldest son. He's a fierce guy.
Yeah.
He'd stare down anything. But that parents put their children in positions like this.
Sure.
And it really bothers me. I've dealt with this kind of idea for a really long time. I call it someone else's war.
Yeah.
The idea that, when you become a parent, maybe it's a good idea to start learning how to end wars, because otherwise you just toss your child into it.
Yeah.
And they're either a weapon or they're, eaten up in it.
Sure.
And it bothers me. I think Duke Leto probably was trying to preserve his family.
Yeah.
I don't think he had any manipulations or anything. He just happened to be, a duke.
Yeah.
And he had a child.
Yeah.
But I am really bothered by Lady Jessica.
Yeah.
That she could manipulate her own child for these purposes.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, that's all you see everywhere. The Harkonnens.
Yeah.
What is it? Fade. He was played by Sting in the other movie, but Fade Rautha.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a nasty character.
He's literally a weapon. I mean, he's as shiny as a dagger.
Yeah, for sure.
And I guess,
and even Beast Rabin, right? Who's played by Dave Bautista. They're both nephews of the Baron, leader of the Harkonnens, and the whole Harkonnen clan is really seems like the evil empire. Everything's black or white, very white, but there's sort of this magical. That's another thing. I was hoping that we could talk about is that there is some sort of fantasy or magical elements to some of these characters, right? Especially they're not human. Some of them are not human. They're maybe just a little beyond human.
Like the Mentat.
Yes, exactly. They are able to speak and persuade people to do things that they don't necessarily would want to do by using their voices, which is maybe, could be a human quality, but I feel as though it goes a little bit beyond. And same with the Harkonnen people. There's an evil to them that goes, and he's, for example, the Baron has sort of these powers of sort of floating, but you have to wonder. I wonder if that's a technological element to it versus a magical quality that he has. So there's that interesting piece that it is 10,000 year 10,000 because they're able to use technology to, if they are human, to do non-human like things.
Well, I have a lot of theories. You're going to learn this about me, but one of my pocket theories is that science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy.
Yeah.
It's science-guided fantasy. And I think you're right. Like, have you seen the meme about it takes a line from Dune and it says, use the voice. And it shows Jerry from Seinfeld saying, well, hello. And
no, I haven't.
I just cracked up at that. That was the best combination. But you're right. So we're seeing things that are beyond. I think we would like to imagine that 10,000 years in the future there would be greater mental ability, that there would be ESP, which, obviously stems out of his obsession with psilocybin and
Sure.
MK Ultra. Robert Heinlein, who's probably the second best known, or he might be a better known author, but none of his novels hit as hard as Dune. His like our era, like doing people's horoscopes and stuff became more and more powerful. And then far in the future, people had advanced mental power. You could tell if somebody was moving below you because of detecting their minds and stuff. So that's played with quite often. But yeah, I mean, when I think about the fantasy elements of this, I think about it in those terms as an exploration of the human mind. Because really, this is a society where they are taking psychotropic drugs all the time, all of them.
Yeah.
And, perception is existence in some sense.
Yeah.
I got a philosophy background, and it's very hard to prove that there's anything outside of what you perceive.
Yeah.
We have object permanence, but couldn't we be fooled by an evil genie about that? So if you have heightened mental states from, these drugs that they're taking all the time, whether or not there are these magical things happening, everybody's seeing it.
Yeah.
So, maybe it's just a shared madness.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. It definitely goes into fantasy. Somebody said that this series is to science fiction what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I think when it comes to like adapting from the books to the movies, it brings up an interesting thing.
Sure.
Because for me, the Lord of the Rings books, I felt like were the best presentation. And then seeing them on the big screen was cool and all, nothing against Peter Jackson, but you literally just have to put Gandalf up there, and I'm going to be like drooling over it, Whereas I mentioned at the top, Dune for me was, okay, now that we've got this presentation, it really works for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you, what did you like most about this movie? And then I'm going to ask, what you think maybe some flaws were. But what did you like most about this movie?
I liked that it had a lot of texture to it. And that's what Herbert's really well known for, and I think Villeneuve picked up on it. And that's that. So I really like Twin Peaks, The Wire. Shows like that are some of my most favorite things. And it's because you could watch 5 minutes of it, and it would fill you in the way that another movie from beginning to end would.
Yeah.
So the world is so well thought out, and it's depicted in such a way on the screen. There were parts that I found boring, but I was like, ooh, I like the details.
Yeah.
I like the visuals of this. And I think that is really its greatest strength, and I think it makes it easy for me to forgive any of the flaws that it has.
Yeah.
How about you?
The setting to me is incredible because who would think a desert planet could actually have all this texture, as you mentioned?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing that there's underneath it all, there's so much life on this planet. It's just a different form of it. And the Fremen people, you have the sandworms, you have all these other creatures, you have these areas and sort of these, not even, I wouldn't even call them mountains, but sort of these small rock hills, the things inside of it. So the fact that the setting is obviously it's called Dune, right? It's the biggest part of this movie. So that to me was amazing, that a setting could be of a desert could be that incredible and well done. The second thing I liked, the hero's journey, right? So the hero's journey with the ups and downs and the flaws, and I think Paul initially is this knight in shining armor type of hero, but now we're starting to see some flaws too.
Right.
And
He might do the right thing, but you might not like him at the end of the day.
He might do the right thing, but he might do the wrong thing too, right? And we don't know that yet. So it's the hero's journey in this, I think, is pretty fascinating to follow as well. What about flaws? Do you find some flaws?
Flaws. I mean,
in the movie,
one was revealed to me by somebody. Well, a couple of people. My wife has read the books and said that there were some things that were kind of taken out that could have easily been in there. Apparently, we're supposed to have already seen the birthing of Paul's younger sister.
Yeah, there's a big question on that too, right?
Right, and for me, that in particular isn't as big of a deal because I haven't read the books.
Right.
But I was also made aware that it ends in a different place than the first book does.
Got it.
And the suggestion there being that they gave either a too long or an incomplete movie to us in order to try to put executives in a position where they had to greenlight a third movie. Knowing that from the outside, it's a little bit annoying, but it's also not that big of a deal for me because I have the great power of ignorance over this.
Right.
In that, it ends in a point where I expect things to end.
Sure.
Nowadays, one of my other theories is that every pitch session, you're required to go into it with the idea that it's going to be episodic because it could either turn into a movie or a miniseries depending on what the studio thinks. And this, there were 30 to 45 minute episodes within it, and it ended on a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, this was a season of a show. It makes a lot of sense as that. So it wasn't a huge thing for me. It was a little bit all over the place. Again, I was more forgiving just because of the texture.
I would agree with you there. That was one of the things I thought. There was a lot going on in the second one, particularly with Harkonnen, the House of Harkonnen, and quite honestly, the Fade Raltha, the nephew, the sort of becomes this foil for Paul. I felt as though that seemed a bit rushed. The whole thing seemed a bit rushed. It was cool and all, and he's this real evil character, but it felt almost unnecessary. If you take just that character out of it, you're going to save 20 it's a long movie too. Yeah. You're going to save 20 minutes because they kind of go off in a tangent to give a little bit of background of him and then how he comes to power. So to me, that was a little bit of a flaw to the movie. I didn't think they necessarily needed that character. The Baron, who is the leader of the Harkonnen people, was probably good enough for me, but so there's definitely a lot going on that you have to really pay attention to follow, which I enjoyed. I absolutely enjoyed it, but I thought there were a couple things that could have been maybe taken out of the movie, and for me it was that character of Fade Rotha.
I kind of thought the type of movie it is, all it really has to do to be a success is to have a coherent plot.
Yeah.
And to be a good use of a CG budget.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, people are going to see it. I mean, I went on a Sunday morning at 8:05. And if I had gone with my wife, we wouldn't have been able to sit together except in the front row. And it was the busiest I've seen that theater in years.
Yeah.
So it's selling.
Yeah.
The writer's strike helped that. We're basically getting this and like Deadpool 3, and I can't think of a lot of other blockbusters.
Yeah.
But, I saw trailers in it for like Godzilla X Kong.
Yeah, I saw that too.
And I'm like, this only exists for CG.
Yeah.
Like, I've seen the other ones. I'm glad that they continue making these stories from other, from Godzilla and Kong over and over again. I think they're really cool. But also, I don't expect anything out of that movie except that there's going to be fights and it's going to be CG.
Yeah.
Whereas this took maybe a similar, maybe a bigger, maybe a smaller CG budget, and it brought us some really great concepts that need that kind of budget. And I just really appreciate that. I mean, if we're looking at a Superman movie next year, And when the Man of Steel movie came out, I was like, I just want to see somebody actually flying in the sky rather than that like blue screen stuff from the 1980s movies.
Yeah.
And if that's all you want, right? I don't think everybody has to have a film degree to go see a movie.
Yeah.
And so I think this one easily checks a lot of the boxes. Maybe if you have a plan on when you're going to go to the bathroom because it's a long movie.
True. I picked I forget what it was, but I picked a good moment during that time.
I think I
did
too.
I missed much.
I don't remember it, but when we talked about Poor Things, we were really trying to figure out who would watch that.
Right.
And this one, I think it's open to people who like artistic stuff, but I think it's also open to anybody. It's a fun blockbuster.
Agreed. Is there anything that would look to wrap up here? Is there anything else you want to say about this movie before we give our final thoughts on it?
Well, really, I'd like to use it as an introduction to the rest of our reviews. We had our first one last month.
Yeah.
I guess the month before. February is nuts for me. It's like a second Christmas. And then we've got this one.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's kicking off the movie season.
Yeah.
And there's a funny history behind that I'm going to go over really quickly.
Yeah.
We got used to these blockbuster movies that may start by Memorial Day, but always there was something on the 4th of July. Do you remember the Will Smith ones? You had Men in Black. You had Independence Day, which made sense as a 4th of July blockbuster. But in 2002, they released Spider-Man, Sam Raimi's movie, the one with Tobey.
That's one of the best ones, I think.
Right. And that's when they started coinciding superhero movies with Free Comic Book Day in the beginning of May. And I think that movie ended up grossing more than, I think Will Smith even had a movie that year. It may have been Wild Wild West. And it basically shifted. It's like moving the U.S. Capitol from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. It changed our movie schedule. You start them in early May if you want to make money. You're not waiting till the 4th of July. If you don't do early May, you can go as late as September. It doesn't even matter anymore. And with Deadpool in 2016, nobody thought that was going to do anything. They buried it in the first quarter of the year, but Ryan Reynolds pushed it as a Valentine's movie. Made tons of money, one of the biggest movies of the year. They started putting the weird things like the Suicide Squad adjacent stuff then. And here we are watching Dune in early March where they throw movies to die.
Yeah.
And it's unlikely that we're going to see another movie to compete with it until the next Deadpool movie comes out.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited that, after the writer's strike, we're actually looking at a movie season. The things that are coming out now are going to be, the exciting things of 2024. We don't have to wait any longer.
Yeah.
We can go see movies. So that's my final words. I'm really excited about it.
I really enjoyed the movie. I guess I'm going to get into my just rating and how I liked it. And again, I think I shared this the last time with Poor Things. This is a movie. It made me think. Definitely questioning what's happening. I'm intrigued by it. It was unique, very different. Story was not recycled, even though yes, it was a book, but it's a unique story. Visually beautiful, just with CGI and just whatever else they're doing. It was just a wonderfully beautiful movie. The setting was very nice. Cinematography, all that. Story, completely interesting with interesting characters. Maybe there's a few too many characters, but still some interesting characters. We didn't even mention Christopher Walken as the Emperor. I've read a couple things on why they choose Christopher Walken.
Was it about the Fatboy Slim song "Weapon of Choice"?
No, just sort of like there was an article about how did Christopher Walken know he was in a Dune movie? They just felt he was.
No, Christopher Walken always plays Christopher Walken.
Exactly. It takes me back to that Saturday Night Live skit of the, with Will Ferrell, but
the more cowbell one.
More cowbell, exactly.
That is there was no cowbell in this movie. We didn't address that.
So acting was great, and music. We didn't talk about it. There was some menacing music in it too, which I thought was very cool, especially when you had to hearken into this evil people. So I really enjoyed it. I look forward. When the movie ended, I was immediately like, trilogy. I didn't know it was going to be a trilogy, and so I was sort of upset. But at the same time, I'm gonna hopefully I'll be around in the not that I'm not old, but it's going to be probably 3 years before the next Dune comes out. So hopefully I'll be around to see it. I'm sure I will. But and so overall, really enjoyed the movie. Out of 5 popcorn stars, I definitely give it 4.5. It was just definitely a blockbuster movie that I really enjoyed.
All right, real quick. I'm the king of tangents. I'm glad you gave us some structure. But so Christopher Walken was in the music video for Weapon of Choice by Fatboy Slim. Mm-hmm. I think it was the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. He's dancing and he goes like up the wall and he's flying at something.
Right.
The song itself, either in part or in whole, is a reference to Dune.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's a line that goes, "Walk without rhythm, and it won't attract the worm."
And
I mean, you hear that, and you can picture,
the worm walk.
Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya doing this like arrhythmic side-by-side dance and all that kind of stuff. But I thought that was a really funny, aside from, Christopher Walken is bringing, his accent into this foreign world. He only knows how to play himself, but also the guy from the music video that's all about Dune is actually in Dune. It was just, pure campiness.
Yeah.
So, for my review, I do think I have like an artistic side and a gen pop side, right? Mm-hmm. My artistic side, the texture's there. The people that were working on this worked hard, and it shows in the final product. Could it have been edited differently? Could it have ended in a different place? Sure, fine. But also, it's just this cool movie where CG is used really well, and I care about what's going on, and they're riding giant worms and stuff. Yeah. So, maybe you would call it the older educated gentleman and the child in me. They were both happy. And I feel like, my kids, if they came of age and were at the point where they could deal with things like losing your dad and all that kind of stuff, I'd have no problem bringing it. I saw a lot of, people who were obviously fans of the original movie taking, 3 goofy kids with them. And I was like, that could be me someday. So I think it's accessible to just about anybody. Really, it's just a matter of how long your bladder or your attention span will let you sit.
Right.
It might be a good one for streaming, Blu-ray, and DVD release.
Yeah.
Where you can pause it. Halfway.
Yeah.
And there might be some. I think there's probably 2 or 3 good places where you could get 45 minutes to an hour and a half in and just stop it and come back to it the next day. So I think it's a really easy to digest movie that offers a lot more than easy to digest movies really do. I'd give it a 4.
Great.
I forgive just about everything in it, except that it's not quite a 5 yet.
Yeah. Well, great. We'll wrap it up here. Thanks for listening to Worth the Popcorn with Justin Tiemeyer and Bill Lee. We both felt it was worth the popcorn and look forward to the next Dune movie. So thanks for joining us here at the Low Ledger Podcast for another installment of Movie Mania.